Grandma's house stood on the edge of a small village, right next to the forest. It always seemed old, even when I was a child. The gray, weather-worn wooden siding and dusty, cloudy windows gave it a timeless, eerie aura. This was the house where my father had grown up, and my brother Dima and I had spent many of our summers there. We loved it. An expansive home filled with endless nooks for playing, a dusty attic brimming with treasures, and a basement that seemed to stretch into shadowy depths. But as we grew older, our feelings about the house began to change. What once seemed like a magical place of adventure became unsettling. Small details we had ignored as children began to catch our attention. Creaking floorboards, the faint sound of movement in empty rooms, shadows that didn't seem to belong. And then there was Grandma's behavior. We visited every summer without fail, but that last summer changed everything. When we arrived, Grandma greeted us with her usual smile and homemade pies. But later, as we settled in, her demeanor shifted. Her expression turned serious, and her tone became hushed. "Children," she said, her voice almost a whisper, "if you hear footsteps in the hallway at night, don't leave your room." Her words hung in the air, and Dima chuckled nervously, thinking she was teasing us. But her stern gaze didn't waver. Dima and I exchanged uneasy looks, and a knot of anxiety began forming in my stomach. The first night passed uneventfully. The house enveloped us in its usual silence, and the comforting smell of dried herbs and lavender lulled us to sleep. We spent the next day exploring the attic, leafing through old family albums and marveling at the peculiar trinkets Grandma had collected over the years. By evening, her strange warning was almost forgotten. But on the second night, I woke to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was the rustling of leaves outside, but then I realized it was coming from the hallway. Quiet, deliberate footsteps creaked across the old wooden floorboards. They were heavy and slow, as if someone was moving carefully, trying not to be noticed. My body stiffened, and I felt my heart start to race. Turning my head, I saw that Dima was awake too. His wide eyes stared at the ceiling, and I knew he'd heard it too. Neither of us said a word. We just lay there, frozen, listening as the footsteps drew closer. They stopped right outside our door. We held our breath, waiting, expecting something or someone to enter. But after a long, agonizing moment, the footsteps resumed, retreating back down the hallway until the house fell silent once more. The next morning, we tried to tell Grandma about what we'd heard. She dismissed it with a wave of her hand, saying it was just the house settling, but I saw the flicker of worry in her eyes, a shadow that told me she knew more than she was letting on. That afternoon, while Grandma was busy in the kitchen, Dima suggested we explore the second floor. We'd always known there was a room up there we weren't allowed to enter. Grandma had told us it belonged to our late grandfather, who had passed away long before we were born. The door to that room was always locked, and Grandma kept the key hidden. But today, to our surprise, the door was slightly ajar. We exchanged uncertain glances before Dima, curiosity getting the better of him, pushed it open. The room greeted us with a cold, musty air, as if it had been sealed for decades. Everything inside was untouched. A rocking chair by the window, a shelf of old books, and a coat hanging on a peg near the door. It was as though Grandpa might walk in at any moment. In the corner of the room stood a large mirror, draped in a heavy cloth. Dima, always the braver of us, crossed the room and pulled the cloth away. At first, all we saw was our own reflection, the two of us staring back at ourselves with wide eyes. But then, something changed. Behind us, in the mirror, a blurry shape began to form. It grew clearer by the second, resolving into the figure of a man. He wore a long coat and an old-fashioned hat, just like Grandpa in the photographs. But where his face should have been, there was only darkness, a gaping void that seemed to draw the light from the room. We bolted, slamming the door shut behind us and not stopping until we were back downstairs, our hearts pounding. Neither of us said a word about what we'd seen, but the fear in Dima's eyes mirrored my own. That evening, as Grandma came to say goodnight, her face was drawn, as though she knew something had happened. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, then repeated her warning from the first night. "Children, if you hear footsteps tonight, do not open your door. No matter what you hear, stay in your room." Her tone was grave, and this time, neither of us dared to laugh it off. I could see that even Dima, who usually brushed off such things, was deeply unsettled. We nodded silently and climbed into bed. The house felt different that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wooden beams seemed louder, more deliberate. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to close my eyes. I could hear Dima shifting restlessly in his bed, and I knew he was just as scared as I was. The footsteps started earlier that night, before we'd even fallen asleep. They were heavier now, more purposeful, and this time they began right outside our door. We could hear them moving slowly, pausing at each room, as if searching for something or someone. When the footsteps reached our door, they stopped. The silence was suffocating. My chest tightened as I watched the door, half expecting it to burst open. Then, with an agonizing creak, it began to slowly swing inward. Dima and I froze, too terrified to move or make a sound. A figure stood in the doorway, its silhouette backlit by the dim light of the hallway. It was the same figure we had seen in the mirror. Grandpa's coat, Grandpa's hat, but no face. Just an empty void where a face should have been. The room grew colder, and the air felt thick, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there watching, or so it seemed, though it had no eyes. Time felt as though it had stopped, and I wasn't sure how long we sat there, paralyzed with fear. Finally, the figure turned and drifted back into the hallway, and the door closed softly behind it. The next morning, neither of us mentioned what had happened. Grandma didn't ask, but her silence spoke volumes. She seemed to know, and her weary eyes suggested this was not the first time something like this had occurred. We packed our bags and left that very day, without looking back. After that summer, we never returned to Grandma's house. Whenever our parents suggested visiting, I would make up an excuse, and Dima would quietly agree. Neither of us wanted to set foot in that place again. Years passed, and Grandma eventually moved in with us. The house, left abandoned, began to crumble, overtaken by the forest at its edge. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see that shadowy figure in the doorway. Its faceless head turned toward me, waiting. And I know it's still there, in that house at the edge of the village, standing in the hallway, listening for footsteps. Years later, after Grandma had passed away, I was faced with a difficult choice. The house was still in our family's name, but it had fallen into disrepair. My parents asked if I wanted to visit the house one last time before it was sold or demolished. I hesitated. Memories of that final summer haunted me, but a part of me felt compelled to go back, to face whatever had happened there, and finally put it behind me. I decided to go alone. The village hadn't changed much. The winding road leading to the house was overgrown, and when I reached the property, it was almost unrecognizable. The garden was now a tangle of weeds, and the house looked even more decrepit, its once sturdy walls sagging under the weight of time. The windows were dark and lifeless, but they seemed to watch me as I approached. I stood on the porch for what felt like an eternity, gathering my courage. Finally, I pushed the door open, and the familiar smell of dust and decay greeted me. The house was eerily quiet, but every step I took echoed like a shout. The house felt different. The warmth it once held, even in its strangeness, was gone. Now it was just cold and empty. I wandered through the rooms, remembering the laughter and stories Grandma used to share. The kitchen was filled with cobwebs, the furniture covered in layers of dust. When I reached the second floor, I stopped in front of the forbidden room. The door was shut, just as we'd left it years ago. For a moment, I considered leaving it alone, but something urged me to go in, as if I was being drawn to it one final time. The door creaked open, and the room looked just as it had before. Grandpa's chair, his books, and that ominous mirror still covered with the same old cloth. The air in the room was heavy, almost suffocating, and I felt an irrational sense of dread. I stepped closer to the mirror, my heart pounding. My hand trembled as I reached for the cloth, hesitating. Why was I doing this? Why couldn't I just leave? Finally, I pulled the cloth away. At first, it was just my reflection, older now, tired, but unmistakably me. Then, just like before, the shadow appeared behind me. It was faint at first, but it grew clearer with each passing second. The same figure, Grandpa's coat and hat, the void where a face should have been. But this time, it moved. I watched in horror as the figure stepped closer in the reflection. My breath caught as I realized it wasn't just in the mirror. It was behind me, in the room. The air turned icy, and I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive. "Why did you come back?" a voice whispered, though I couldn't tell if it came from the figure or from the walls themselves. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure reached out, its hand dark and undefined, and I felt a cold, bone-deep chill as it touched my shoulder. My vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I saw something, a memory that wasn't mine. A younger version of Grandpa, standing in this room, arguing with someone I couldn't see. There was anger, desperation, and then nothing. The figure in the mirror seemed to grow taller, more imposing, as if feeding on my fear. My legs finally obeyed me, and I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair as I fled from the room. The door slammed shut behind me on its own, and I didn't dare look back. I ran downstairs, my mind racing. I had to leave, to escape this house and never come back. But as I reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. I pulled and yanked, but it was as if the house itself had locked me in. The whispers started again, this time all around me, coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. They overlapped, growing louder until they were almost deafening. "Leave, stay, help us. You shouldn't have come." Desperately, I turned back toward the hallway, and there it was again, the figure. It stood at the bottom of the stairs, motionless, watching. But this time, there were others. Faint shadows flickered in and out of existence around it, like echoes of people who had once been here. I realized then that the house wasn't just haunted by Grandpa. It was haunted by the weight of the past, by memories and regrets that had festered for years. And now, I was a part of it. With a surge of adrenaline, I ran past the figure, avoiding its outstretched hand, and hurled myself at a window. The glass shattered around me as I tumbled onto the overgrown lawn. I didn't stop running until I was back at my car. I never told my parents what happened that day. When they asked, I said the house was too far gone, not worth keeping. It was sold to someone who planned to tear it down, and I made sure I wasn't there to see it happen. But even now, I dream of that house. I see the hallway, the forbidden room, and the shadows that waited for me. I hear the whispers, faint but insistent, calling me back. Sometimes I wonder if the house is truly gone, or if somewhere in that quiet village it still stands, waiting for its next visitor.